Wayne LaPierre wins re-election at the NRA, but not without dissension. Plus, an interview with The Atlantic's Adam Serwer. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I am your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com. If you want to get this podcast a day early, make sure you head over to thereload.com and buy a membership where you will get not only access to this particular podcast a day early, but you will get exclusive access to our members only posts, which often includes most of our analysis on the news of the week in the gun world. So if you want to know more about what I'm thinking, what I'm seeing in the gun world, what our contributing writer Jake Fogelman is thinking and seeing, make sure you sign up today. If you want to help support the Reload, that is the ideal way to do it, because we are 100% reader funded at this point, and we need your support to survive and to go on trips to cover stories like the NRA's members meeting and the board meeting, which I went to in Charlotte, North Carolina this week, where Wayne LaPierre was reelected as the CEO and executive vice president of the organization for the, it's been several decades now that he's been in control of the organization. And this time it happened even though there was actually some dissension, interestingly. You had a board member who is a dissenter who has been involved in trying to, I guess, change the direction of the organization after they've come under heavy scrutiny from New York's Attorney General over allegations of corruption against Wayne LaPierre and others in the top of the agency or top of the organization there, accused of diverting tens of millions of dollars, really, of the NRA's funds towards their own personal expenses for luxury items like private flights and fancy suits and luxury trips to different parts of the world. But that board member, Phil Journey, he actually nominated somebody to run against Wayne LaPierre at this year's board meeting, or this board meeting in North Carolina. He nominated a former board member who actually his term just ended, and he was also another one of the board members, the small number of board members who have attempted to try and fight in court against the leadership of the NRA, against Wayne LaPierre and the other executives. Rocky Marshall is his name. He received 2 votes at the board meeting. Wayne received 44, and then there were 3 members who did not vote at all. Now, if you know anything about the NRA board, you'll notice that is the math does not add up there. There are 76 board members on the NRA board. It's a very big board. It's not common to have that many board members. Now, the NRA says that this is in part due to the fact that they have a lot of committees that the NRA does work on. And so that's why they have so many board members. One of the reasons, I guess. And, but anyway, that means about 27, I believe, is the correct number there. Didn't vote in the election at all because they didn't show up to the meeting, which is another common issue at the NRA. For instance, the board meeting that I attended in Dallas, after Wayne LaPierre took the group into bankruptcy, which ultimately failed for being filed in not in good faith. So the group wasn't bankrupt. Somewhat complicated as a part of their legal strategy to avoid that New York lawsuit or to defeat it. It didn't work out, but Wayne took the group into bankruptcy on his own. The board met in an emergency board meeting to vote on whether or not to approve of that move. And many board members did not show up to that meeting either. I think it was about 40% of them didn't show up at the emergency bankruptcy board meeting. So this is a common issue at the NRA to not have very many of the board members actually show up, even for important votes like the one we saw in Charlotte. But at the end of the day, Wayne LaPierre was reelected again, but for the first time in a long time, there was some dissension, and there was a recorded vote on whether or not he should be EVP. He won handily, but It's still interesting to see the internal dynamics at play at the country and really the world's largest gun rights organization as it goes through a very serious legal challenge that could threaten its very existence here in the future. And another thing that's become common, in addition to board members not attending the NRA meeting, is that I was the only member of the press who was at the board meeting. I wasn't allowed inside because it was closed to press, and I don't carry an active membership right now, mainly out of concerns for, the appearance of conflict of interest. I don't think it's a big issue, but I'd prefer not to have a membership in the organization while I'm writing about them. If it becomes required that I do so to, be able to better report on the organization, I will do that. We'll see how things work out in the future. But this time, at this particular meeting, I was not allowed to sit in on the board meeting. However, of course, the NRA members and a number of the board members who attended informed me of what was happening inside anyway, so it wasn't much of a disadvantage in terms of being able to tell you all what happened there. But yes, there was a vote over who should lead the NRA, and Wayne won, but it's not a common thing to see happen at the NRA, so that is interesting. And if you want to know about that, you should subscribe to the Reload because, again, it's the only place you're going to get this kind of reporting, apparently. No one else sent a single reporter there. So make sure you head over to the site and buy a membership if you care to know what's happening inside the NRA. It's kind of an important organization, as I think everyone who listens to this podcast can understand when it comes to gun politics in America and the gun laws and so on and so forth. But in addition to the NRA news, we have a piece from Jake Fogelman, our contributing writer, who's not able to join us because of technical difficulties this week. So we'll have to get that sorted out for next week. So hopefully all of the Fogelman fans, the Fogel fans, I think is a good term for those of you who are becoming fans of Jake. Perhaps if you want to call yourselves that and group together, form an alliance of sorts, I would not be opposed. I think that would be a great name. Anyway, he wrote about the gun sales numbers. So 2021 now through the end of September has recorded 13.7 million background checks that were related to gun sales, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, analysis of the raw FBI numbers, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System numbers. And that is, in fact, more than all of 2019, which is remarkable given that the highest gun sales months of the year are still in front of us here in 2021. The fall and winter months are where you tend to see more gun sales, not fewer. The summer is where you tend to see fewer gun sales. There's a seasonal pattern to gun sales in America. And, due to things like the hunting season starting up in most parts of the country, and then obviously the holiday season where people tend to give guns to each other in America. That is a common thing to happen. The biggest gun sales day of the year is Black Friday. So, we still have all that in front of us in 2021 here. So likely the numbers will be well beyond what we saw in 2019 and will likely rival what we saw last year in 2020. Though, again, September was the second highest sales month ever for guns, or September ever, not month ever, but the second highest September in history for gun sales, and second to 2020, which is the trend, as I've written about a number of times, we've talked about on the podcast before. That's where 2021 seems to have ended up. The new normal now is second best ever. We are past the surge and on to the new plateau, which is much higher, as you can tell from this story, than where we were beforehand. So we'll have to continue to watch that and see what develops and see how these next few months here go when gun sales traditionally pick back up, and how we turn out for the year compared to 2020. But I think there's several more stories over at The Reload if you want to check those out, or if you sign up for our free newsletter, you will get all of them in your inbox for free every week, every Friday morning. And then obviously the members get an extra newsletter on Sunday mornings that goes over more analysis of the weekend and gives sometimes a hint at what's ahead and what I've been doing, what I'm up to, cool things like that. So make sure you go over, join today. We are going to head over to an interview now with Adam Serwer of The Atlantic. I just had my first piece published in The Atlantic recently, and I've known Adam for a while. He's a reasonable guy. He's interesting on top of that. So I think our conversation is interesting. And he was just attacked by a Supreme Court justice. So his work is at the very least influential. So we're going to head over there now, and I'll let myself take it away there. All right, I'm here with The Atlantic's Adam Serwer to give us a fresh perspective for the podcast. Somebody who I think is going to bring a different point of view than some of the other guests we've had on previously. And that's one of the main things I want to try to do with this show, is get a variety of opinions and perspectives, especially informed ones. And I think Adam is one of my favorite writers out there, who I don't necessarily always agree with, but I think he's always got a thought-provoking take that isn't just, screaming into adding to the noise of most media commentary. So, Adam, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself for listeners who might not have heard of you before?
Sure. And thank you, Stephen, for that very kind introduction. My name is Adam. I'm a writer for The Atlantic. I typically write a lot about race and citizenship, and that, is a pretty broad beat. One that I think I sort of settled on over the past 5 years or so, but that I wasn't necessarily always focused on. I actually used to cover the Supreme Court, which is something we're going to get to in here. And I'm a subscriber to Stephen's newsletter, which is very well written. And I always, I don't know a lot about guns, so I find Stephen's newsletter very informative. And it was the reason that I knew that, Biden's ATF nominee was going to be in big trouble. And of course, he ended up withdrawing. So congrats to Stephen on breaking some of those stories as well.
Thank you.
My area of interest is typically race and American history, which is something that has become hot right now, but was not always an area of tremendous political interest. But obviously, it's a huge fault line in American politics at the moment, as it has been, in the past.
Sure.
For different reasons and in different ways.
Yeah. And actually, going off of that, because obviously race and guns has a long history of intersection in American politics and American policy. So, and like you said, you've spent a lot of time writing about the Supreme Court as well. In fact, I think one of the Supreme Court justices called you out specifically today to complain about a piece that you'd written, Alito, right? So you certainly are read. He did not appreciate my criticism of what I felt was the court's strategic inaction in the Texas abortion case. I live here in Texas, and I assume your listeners probably know this already, but the Texas law was sort of designed to evade judicial review, which has, made it a target of criticism, not just from people who support abortion rights, but also people who think, people on the right who oppose abortion, but think that, laws should not be written so as to evade court scrutiny. And actually wrote a bit about that law for the Reload on how it's likely to be adopted by gun control activists at some point, I would expect in the future as well. It's interesting. I don't think it's going to work out. I don't think that scheme is going to work out as well for them, because part of part of the way the reason the Texas law was functional in the way that it is that it, because of the court's composition, people are less likely, abortion providers or people groups that support abortion rights are less likely to want to
enter a court challenge because they fear that the court will then use that to overrule Roe v. Wade.
Sure.
Whereas I think if you're a gun owner in New York City, and New York adopts a scheme similar to the Texas law, the line's going to be around the block for gun owners to say, okay, I want to violate this law, so then I can sue and get to the Supreme Court. It's just like the scheme is not as functional when you have a court that's pretty friendly to the right in question. So that's why that weekend, I think in the Washington Post, an abortion doctor here in San Antonio, where I live, talked about, he said, I performed an abortion, I violated the law, and you can sue me. And some of the anti-abortion groups that had supported the law were saying, we're arguing that, the courts shouldn't take up these cases because they actually didn't want the lawsuits. They don't want the law. They don't want anybody to end up actually challenging the law because they just want it to sort of remain in this liminal space forever. Mm-hmm. But you really can't do that with gun rights. It's not going to work. They could try it, but I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, I think. But certainly you could probably make a similar argument about some of the laws, the gun laws that exist, these outlier laws like Hawaii, for instance, has almost a total ban on all forms of gun carry at this point. And so they're sort of ripe for challenge, but they oftentimes localities will pass laws anyway because it, just like in Texas, it sort of lines up with their political interests to try and push the boundaries on these things. So in places like D.C. or California or Hawaii, New York, Maryland, New Jersey, where the politics are aligned to push the boundaries on gun laws, you still see laws get passed there oftentimes until they're forced to be repealed by the courts. So it'll be interesting to see, though. I mean, I think that's a fair point. Like, yes, it's much more likely that with a court that is more friendly towards the Second Amendment or Second Amendment protections or extending Second Amendment protections than they are towards abortion protections, that you may have more hesitance to go that route. Although that's actually one of our first topics that I wanted to talk about is the Supreme Court now. I guess, the court hasn't really been that aggressive on guns in the past decade. Now people expect that they'll become more active on the issue, I guess, with the new appointments from the Trump administration sort of settling in. And now we've seen them take one case. It's the first major gun carry case that appears as though it will go to the merits, because obviously they had one last year that ended up being declared moot based off of some actions that the New York government took to make it moot after it had already been accepted by the court. But now they're considering gun carry. It's the first major case they're likely to have a big decision on since McDonald back in, was it 2010? So it's been over a decade now. There was a lot of expectation that Heller and McDonald would lead to a lot more cases, but they haven't to this point. And we don't know exactly what the court's going to come out, how this is going to actually turn out. At the end of the day, we still have to wait and see. I think most people expect that New York's may issue concealed carry law, which allows essentially government officials in New York to have great discretion over who gets to have a concealed carry permit, based essentially off of whether or not that official, I think in the case of New York, it's county judges, whether they believe the person has a good reason to carry their firearm for self-defense where, in public, even if that person has passed, the training requirements and the background check, they still could be denied under this sort of system that New York has and that 7 other states have as well, and which has been upheld and struck down at the circuit level, creating a split that has now resulted in this case being taken by the court. But what I wanted to talk with you about just a little bit here is some of the dueling briefs that have been filed in this case. We just got the deadline for all the amicus briefs passed earlier this month. or in September, and we had some significant groups come down on either side of this. You had, for instance, the ACLU and the NAACP in referencing specifically the racial aspect of may issue gun permits laws. They acknowledged the sort of racist history of this type of policy, and said that it was not the appropriate remedy to strike down this New York's law completely, because New York's law is not specifically designed with racist intent, is I think essentially the argument they're making there, and that for that equal protection suits are better remedy for any concerns about the racial outcomes of these kind of laws that still exist today, rather than Second Amendment suits. And then you had groups like the National African American Gun Association and the Public Defenders of New York come down on the other side, where they discussed the racist history of these kinds of policies and also the disparity in how they're currently enforced in New York as well, with minorities facing more prosecutions compared to their, actual distribution in society, as we've often talked about, right, with lots of other laws about how how their actual enforcement impacts different communities differently. Usually with African Americans, especially young African American men, being prosecuted at higher rates for crimes committed under these laws. And so there's this dichotomy, right? There's this distinction between two sides here that see different, have totally different views of whether this law is racially discriminatory or whether it's constitutional, it should be struck down. I just wanted you to speak a little bit to that divide and give us some of your insight.
Well, so it's a difficult issue, right? Because there's no question that there's an expectation that any time, because of the way the American criminal justice system works, there's an expectation on the left that any kind of law that you pass is going to be enforced is more likely to be enforced against Black people than white people, because Black communities are more heavily policed. So on the one hand, the Black voters strongly support gun control because Black neighborhoods tend to bear the brunt of gun violence. So they want to see more controls on firearms because they want to reduce gun violence. At the same time, there's this issue of, Black people who are simply trying to protect themselves who end up getting prosecuted under gun laws, strict gun laws. And so you have this sort of competing interests, and I can kind of understand it from both sides. I think that the larger issue is that there are so many guns that it's very hard for gun restrictions to be effective in any real sense. Like, I'm not sure, if this law was struck down, I'm not sure how much in New York would change. Just moving from DC to Texas, which is a place that has a very obviously, a very long tradition of gun ownership. The Texas legislature passes these pro-gun laws every year, and there's not a lot that really changes. And part of the reason for that is, you can pass as many open carry laws as you want, but every business in Texas is going to be you can't bring firearms in here. So it's really not convenient to take your gun literally everywhere you go if you live in a city. Because, property rights, you say you're not allowed in a particular business establishment. And I'm not sure how many people in New York, even if they're allowed to, if the Supreme Court loosens or strikes down the law, it seems likely to me that the New York legislature would pass a different kind of law that would be designed to, evade whatever legal standard that the Supreme Court sets up, because their constituents, it's a blue state, their constituents are concerned about gun violence and they want some kind of restrictions to lower gun violence. So it seems to me that, I mean, even though this is a big case, and you can correct me on this, Dean, because you know this stuff better than I do, but it seems to me that not a tremendous amount changes if this regulatory scheme is struck down.
Right. Well, yeah, actually, we can look at your hometown, D.C., for an example of what might happen if the court strikes down New York's law, because D.C. is where the circuit split happened, because the D.C. circuit struck down D.C.'s may issue law a few years back. Well, initially, D.C. had a total ban on all gun carry, as it's wont to do. It likes to be out on a limb, as strict as it possibly can be on gun issues, gun laws. So it had a total ban that got struck down. Actually, for a few days in D.C., they had permitless carry effectively, because their law against concealed carry or any kind of carry had been struck down and wasn't being enforced. So you were able to carry very briefly during that time period in D.C. without a permit, which I actually did at the time.
I remember you tweeting that you were doing that.
Yes. So, no one was harmed in the making of that video where I briefly carried without a permit in D.C. But then D.C. passed a May issue law, very similar to what, not so much New York. New York has kind of a weird variant on this basic idea of May issue, because usually in New York, they'll issue you a gun carry permit, but most of them effectively have restrictions that make it impossible to carry in the vast majority of public places. And so that's more how their law works compared to, California or Maryland, where they just won't give you a permit at all. And so DC passed a law like that. And then that got challenged and struck down in Wren as well. And so DC eventually got, I guess, the message here, which is that the courts were not going to allow them to, at least the DC Circuit wasn't going to allow them to have that style of law.
I mean, DC is a good example of what we're talking about, really. I mean, DC is a city whose constituents have suffered a lot from gun violence over the years. When I was growing up there in the 90s, obviously, 80s and 90s, it was a huge issue. And so gun restrictions are very popular. And the city council is responsive to that. And there's been, obviously there's been a rise in homicides that has happened over the past year, which I think, if I were to hazard a guess, my big theory is that people are at home and drinking and then acting recklessly. If I had to hazard a guess for why that's happening, because it seems to be uniform throughout the country. Right. But in DC, people who have not previously had experiences with seeing a shooting in public have seen them. And so I think that puts a lot, there's a lot of political pressure for city officials to do something when things like that start happening.
Sure. But so DC eventually passed a shall issue law, which they have now. Yeah. Now, it's a fairly restrictive version of shall issue. So shall issue is where effectively the government officials' personal judgment is taken out of the process. And so long as you go through the steps required to obtain a permit, you will be granted one. So if you pass the background check, you take the training that's required, they have to give you a permit. They shall issue you a permit instead of they may issue you.
How many people actually do that? Do you know?
In DC, there's, I believe it's a couple thousand at this point. They've issued a bunch more in recent years, probably in part due to some of the rising violence we've seen over the last year and a half. I know there's just a report out recently about how there was a significant increase in the number of permits issued in the city. I'm actually not aware of a single example of somebody with a permit committing
using any
sort of crime. Not that is obviously there are people who have concealed carry permits in America who commit crimes, although from data from I believe Florida and Texas, which released their all of the crimes committed by anyone who has a concealed carry permit, they tend to be people who commit crimes at a lower rate than police officers do. and a much lower rate than the general public. As you might imagine, for somebody who's going to go through the process to get a permit to carry a gun, they will tend to be more law-abiding by nature, I would guess.
That's also, it would seem not to be very wise to commit, if you're going to commit a felony, to commit it with your government license-issued firearm. Right. Seems like a very unwise approach.
Sure. But so, we have seen sort of a real world example of what you were wondering about, like what would happen in New York if this goes through. And it, probably would see DC style shall issue laws get passed in, the remaining places that still have may issue, which, to be fair, it's only 8 states, but those 8 states are some of the largest states. So they make up about 25% of the population, California, New York, New Jersey. And so it still would be a fairly significant thing to have this happen. But you probably see quite a lot more Americans by, raw number obtain concealed carry permits than right now. But I am doubtful that how much of an effect it would have on the crime rate either way, I think is a very open question. I mean, again, you look at DC, I'm not aware of any evidence that people who obtain concealed carry permits in DC are any sort of driver of violence in DC. And then at the same time, obviously, you have seen an increase in at least the murder rate in DC as well, just like the rest of the country over the last year and a half, which again is probably due to factors beyond whether or not concealed carry permits are easily obtainable. Of course, I think that the general argument for concealed carry advocates, you will get people who argue that just more guns is less crime, just like you get people who argue less guns equals less crime as well. Both positions, in my view, are pretty unsupported by evidence.
I think it's hard. I think it's hard. I think I think it's probably the case that if you have 0 guns in a country, then you're not going to have a lot of gun crime.
Sure.
The question is there a scheme of regulation that can be effective in a country that has a long tradition of gun ownership? Yeah. And I think they're probably and one that would pass constitutional muster, particularly with this Supreme Court. And I don't know what the answer to that question is.
Yeah, and I mean even your commonly cited examples of trips on either side, where it's like less guns equals less crime. You often see people bring up Australia, where they instituted a gun confiscation program on a much smaller scale than what you would need in the United States, where, I mean, people don't really understand the true scale of gun ownership in America, even gun owners themselves, frankly. Like, you'll hear numbers thrown around, like, the Small Arms Survey estimates there's over 400 million firearms owned by civilians in the United States, right? And that's a huge number, right? And we know that's a big number, but I think people don't get the scale of that number, because the same survey estimates there are about 1 million small arms owned by all of the law enforcement agencies in the entire country. So civilians own 400 times more firearms than the entire law enforcement apparatus of the United States. And I believe the number is 4 million for the entire United States military as far as small arms go, right? Rifles and handguns and shotguns, things like that. And so again, 100 times more small arms are owned by American civilians than the American, I believe that's, than the American military combined. And then I believe it's 10 million small arms for the entire world's military. So, just
what
to give,
percentage of the population is gun owners, though?
The percent, it depends on how you're estimating it. If you ask people directly whether they own a gun personally, you'll get somewhere between 30 and 35% of Americans, which is still about 100 million.
That's a large number, but it does seem like that people who own a gun probably own more than one.
Sure. Yeah, that's
or
common.
that there's like there's a large percentage of gun owners who not simply own one firearm.
Yeah, certainly.
And that 35%. Obviously, it's not a small number of people, but
right. Although if you ask people if they have a gun in their home, which is a slightly different question than whether they personally own a gun, they might get slightly different answers. And you also have the issue of people not wanting to tell a stranger over the phone whether they own guns or not. So it perhaps decreases the numbers being reported, because most of the surveys that do this, like Gallup and Pew, it's a phone survey. And so
has that 35% number changed?
It has
a lot
changed significantly over the last, decade or so. But if you ask people if they have a gun in their home, you get more into 40 to 45%. So it's an even larger percentage. Obviously, it's still not a majority of American adults. I believe the number is something like 120 million people report having adults report having a gun in their home. So it's a lot of people, obviously, and the frequency of gun ownership fluctuates, I'm sure, quite a lot between different states with different laws, like California or Nevada, or California or Arizona, even though they're neighboring states. I'm sure that it's hard to know for sure. Obviously, we don't have a national gun registry for good reason. Obviously, a lot of gun rights advocates would say, but so you can't really know a lot of these things 100%. But we can get some idea of it. But the point is, a lot of people own guns, a lot more than Australia, where I think they confiscated something like 5 million guns, which would be nothing here in the United States. I mean, even if you confiscated, let's just say AR-15s, right? Modern sporting rifles, as the industry calls them. That subset of guns, which in America is the most controversial, right? That's what we're always fighting about with assault weapons, so-called assault weapons bans. There's estimated to be somewhere around 16 million of those in owned by American civilians today. Now, again, it's a big number, but people don't really get the context of that. Again, 16 times more guns than the entire arsenal of the American law enforcement community combined. And so even if you were to, confiscate 90% of those, you'd still have.
When you say confiscate, do you mean legally compel people to turn them in?
Sure,
or
like what Beto has said, right?
Offer money, we don't want you to own this and we'll pay you to give it back.
Yeah, I mean, that's more a question about how could you effectively confiscate guns? I'm just saying, if you were able to, whatever means you used, let's say you passed a law that made it mandatory and you paid 10 people $10,000 a piece for their ARs. And so lots of people complied, and everyone who didn't got, theirs taken away. Whatever the means would be. This is a fantasy scenario, but even in that case, you're still going to have more AR-15s in civilian hands than there are all guns in police hands in the entire country. Right?
See, I don't actually know if the numbers are really the obstacle here. I actually think it is more the political tradition around guns that is a larger obstacle to anything like that. I don't think it's the actual number. I don't know. I can't imagine a situation in which you would go, the American government would support someone going door to door to take away anything at all, ever. I can't think of anything. I can't think of another object in history where something like that would happen. But I also think, there's obviously a long political tradition around firearms in the United States that I think makes that kind of scheme politically infeasible.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. My point here is just, I think you're absolutely right as far as the political practicality of a mass gun confiscation in the United States ever happening is near zero. I mean, it would. I don't even want to get into the consequences of trying to implement something like that in real life. But my point is just that the scale of gun ownership in America is not well understood, and so even if you even when you look at the Australian gun confiscation, which was associated with or happened alongside a decrease in violent crime in Australia, right? This is a common argument that you hear. for why less guns equals less crime. You hear this quite a lot. Now, of course, this happened in the 1990s, right? And so what happened in the United States, which, to my point, has far more guns that you would need to confiscate to get to an effect like what the Australians had in terms of how many, what percentage of the population.
It seems to me it would be far easier. I mean, politically speaking, it would be feasible in, some hypothetical political circumstance to ban the manufacture of those guns, but not to eliminate.
Well, we did that once, right?
Right. We did that once already under Clinton.
Yes.
But not to remove them from commercial circulation. I think that would be difficult.
Yeah, certainly. But my only point here, I'm sorry, I keep getting us sidetracked, but my only point here is that, yes, Australia experienced a decrease in violent crime between the 90s and now, and they happen to have implemented a confiscation program in that country in that time period. But if you look at the United States, and so people point to that as like, oh, this is evidence that fewer crimes means, fewer guns means fewer crimes. But if you look at what happened in the United States in the same time period, the number of guns here increased significantly in terms of the number of background checks on gun sales done in the time period between the 1990s and today. The numbers are in the tens of millions, if not 100 million plus. But and in that same time period, we saw the same decrease in violent crime. Now, this is over the last year and a half. We've seen an increase in specific kinds of violent crime, specifically murder. But the trend matches, even though the United States basically did the exact opposite policy of what Australia did, which is to sell a lot more guns. And then at the same time, obviously, you can look at the crime rates of other countries which have fewer guns and see that their violent crime rates are lower, especially their gun crime rates. So the idea that more guns automatically equals less crime is also, I think, a stretch. But you get these sort of, arguments made all the time, and I think it's a bit with lacking in nuance, to say the least. But I guess one area this extends to that I wanted to talk to you briefly about is the governor's race in Texas that's coming up, because now we have Beto O'Rourke getting in apparently again to this. Well, I guess he's running for governor for the first time. He ran for Senate and then president, but and failed at both of those things. But he's been a buzzworthy candidate for quite a while now. In the Texas Great Blue Hope, I guess. And now he's at it again. And obviously, I think our listeners will remember him mainly for his pledge to take Americans' AR-15s and AK-47s away from them by force, if necessary. And I wonder what you think about how that's going to play in Texas specifically.
Well, I think, Abbott is underwater, which is unusual. And I think the reason for that is that he has, he's facing a primary challenge from his right. And he has sort of a reputation as kind of an elder statesman, as in he's very conservative, but he's not a crazy person. And Texas is a, right of center state. And so, people want a relatively conservative governor. And he was seen as like a responsible person, not, loony. And his handling the pandemic, he has, he's played a lot of games. He did this thing where he banned masks, but then, sort of when things got really bad in 2020, and cities started issuing, mask requirements, he was like, see, I told you you could do that. He just played a lot of games with efforts to mitigate the pandemic and with, interfering with city jurisdictions, like ability to pass restrictions to mitigate the pandemic. And obviously, there's sort of a myth of Texas is like Austin is the only blue area in Texas, but that's not really true. I mean, Texas is experiencing the same political rural urban political polarization as everywhere else in the country. So a lot of the cities are, pretty liberal.
Does that leave an open path for Beto, or do you think his comments
it obviously
torpedo?
It has, it has made the state bluer. Romney beat Obama here by double digits, and Trump beat Biden by single digits. So obviously the state is getting more modern, and Beto came close against Cruz in 2018. But anytime it's a midterm election, the president's party usually suffers. So even though Abbott is unpopular because of the way he's handled the pandemic, that doesn't mean necessarily that they want someone significantly to his left. Beto is not the usual model of the red state Democratic governor. The reason why Democrats like him is that he provokes a lot of enthusiasm in the state. He spent a lot of time doing something that Texas Democrats have not been good at over the past few years, which is he's run around the state trying to register voters and build a party infrastructure. I think that, so far the polling for him is not tremendously positive. And he would be going into a headwind because it's a midterm in a year when the Democrat controls the White House. As far as the gun issue, when I talk to Texas Democratic consultants, they've been pretty clear to me that he's going to have to walk back from the things he said when he was running for president.
Do you think that's even possible at this point, given how forceful he was about it and how much attention he got for it?
That's not up to me. Obviously, it's a question of whether, Texas voters believe his walk back, whether they prioritize other issues besides that. And so, maybe they don't believe him, but they prefer him to Abbott anyway. So there's a lot of questions that go into that. I think that, obviously Texas is a state with a lot of gun owners and people who support gun rights. So it's going to be an issue for him. He's going to have to deal with it at some point. If you, even in south of I-10, which is like a pretty democratic area, you have a lot of rural Latino voters who own guns, who work in ranching, things like that. So I think it's going to be an issue for him. I don't like to predict the outcomes of political races because I'm not very good at that. What I can say is that I think obviously Beto's a weird candidate for governor of Texas because he's not, necessarily a moderate. He's to the right of Democrats on certain issues, particularly with regards to the border. But he's obviously, he's more of a base enthusiasm candidate than a centrist. And I don't know whether that's a good strategy in a state like Texas, but I also don't know that it won't work.
Sure.
It really sort of depends on how the Democratic base in Texas is feeling and how the conservative base is feeling. If Republican voters have soured on Abbott because they feel like he's a sellout or they, or something like that, it might be a competitive race. But that's part of the reason why Abbott has been, trying to shore up his right flank over the past couple of years.
Sure.
So it's primary challenge.
I just get kind of tired of seeing the same people, the same like 10 people run for office all the time and having to talk about them again and again. Like Beto has failed twice now to be this, new blue Texas guy. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to do this again. I don't know, maybe somebody else in the primary will surpass him.
To be completely honest, there isn't a deep bench of Texas Democrats because they haven't, held statewide office in like 30 years. So
sure.
There's not a tremendous, I suppose if you want to do something like in Louisiana or Kentucky, you would find, a relatively conservative, a Democrat who has a good, who has a statewide reputation for being a moderate and try to run them. I'm not sure why they haven't tried to do that.
Wasn't a lot of Beto's excitement comes from outside of Texas, right? He can raise money from
he can raise money
liberals across the country, I guess.
There's an issue of, part of the issue with the urban rural polarization is if you nominate a moderate, are you going to depress turnout in areas where you need to juice it?
Sure.
So it's, and this is one of the reasons why when people keep talking about, I think like it is an obvious way in which Texas is trending blue, but I don't necessarily know that a Democrat is going to win a statewide election here anytime soon necessarily.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, sort of the old canard about demographic change always must mean that, Democrats will get every minority vote in Texas moving forward. I mean,
I think that's actually not the case.
Yeah.
I think it's obviously not the case. I mean, one Democrat said to me, when he was talking, I mean, you look at Zapata County, that county that flipped along the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, look, there's like multiple reasons why that happened. Obviously one of the reasons was Joe Biden saying in a debate, we got to phase out fossil fuels. Yeah. Well, if you're in a county where most of the jobs come from energy companies,
right.
It doesn't really matter what race you are. You're going to be like, well, I don't want to lose my job, especially if your bosses are telling you, if Joe Biden gets elected, we're going to close this place down.
Right.
That's going to exercise a big influence on your vote. So I think, it is certainly a case. It is a mistake to assume that demographic change necessarily means, Democrats are going to see
Yes,
I see this.
You hear this a lot on both sides these days.
You hear this a lot on both sides, right? You can hear on Fox News. There's all this talk about like replacement and stuff like that, but it's not actually true. You cannot just because someone is Latino or does not mean that their political philosophy is going to be liberal,
right? And
particularly if you come from a country that is right. Particularly if your family has come to the United States from a country that has a liberal left-wing government, you're not necessarily going to be all that receptive to people you see as reflecting that kind of political philosophy.
Right.
So I think it's a mistake. I mean, I think whenever people on right or left assume that those demographic changes are going to be positive for Democrats, that's a mistake.
Right.
I've actually written at length about this, but
certainly. And just one final point on that: minorities are not a monolith. Idea here, specifically back to guns. I think on the right, or in the gun rights community, not necessarily on the right, but in the gun rights community, people who advocate for gun rights, especially for all sorts of people from all kinds of different backgrounds. The narrative is often that gun control has very distinctly racist origins in the United States, dating back to things like the Black Codes in the antebellum South during slavery, continuing on through the Jim Crow era in post-Civil War South up till the Civil Rights Movement, and even necessarily, even in how the outcomes are affecting minorities today, in how some of these laws are actually enforced in practice. Disparity in how and who gets convicted. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but that is kind of the full view that you get from gun rights activists when we hear about race and guns in America. And I just wonder if you think that is, if you have any thoughts on that, and you think there's more needs to be added to be considered more context, because obviously, like you spoke about, most Black Americans support gun control policies at a higher rate than most white Americans do, and now why would they do that? Obviously, if they believe that the policies were racist, so there's obviously some component here that is not often discussed, and I was wondering if you could just give us a quick roundup on that.
There's no question. I mean, as a historical matter, there's no question that there were a lot of laws passed after the Civil War that had after Reconstruction, that had the intent of disarming, in particular, Black Union veterans who were seen as, even if that was not necessarily, who were seen as competent militarily. These are guys who knew how to fight. And they very much, while they were, Reconstruction ended with a campaign of violence by, Democratic aligned paramilitaries against Black voters who mostly voted Republican at the time. And part of this was not just disenfranchisement by the ballot, but also disarming them so that they could not physically resist, these acts of terrorism. But today, obviously, the big issue is gun violence. So, you have these communities that are suffering disproportionately from gun violence, disproportionately from, discrimination from law enforcement. And so, they are more likely to support restrictions, despite the fact, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with the anecdotes. I mean, obviously, Martin Luther King's entourage was armed,
and Martin Luther King was denied a gun carry permit in a major state.
Obviously, everybody's seen the iconic Malcolm X photo of him defending his home, looking out the window. But it's, it's not, you're not going, I mean, like, if you want to tell black voters that they are more likely to be prosecuted under gun restrictions than white people, they already know that because it's true of most laws in the United States. But, the issue with gun violence is, it's,
although I will say
it's such a huge problem that people obviously want relief from it. Like,
sure.
It is, I don't know if you've ever known anybody who's been shot, but it's awful. It's awful to lose your friends and classmates, your loved ones. So people support gun restrictions because they want to see less of that happening. And so the issue is really that there's just so many guns that, in my mind, it's very hard for gun restrictions to be effective because there's so many guns around that the black market in firearms is just, is so easily accessible by anybody who's determined to obtain a gun unlawfully.
I would say one thing I would add, because I think I agree with you a lot on everything you just said there. One thing I would add is that while black Americans might, have a good understanding that they're more likely to be prosecuted under gun laws today, even because they're more likely to be prosecuted under a lot of different kind of laws, we talk a lot more in the media about other laws that have disproportionate effects on black Americans than we do about gun laws, frankly, in the way we discuss them. To me, that's a problem. But perhaps you agree with me there. But yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you again for coming on. And can you tell people a little bit? You have a book that's out now. If they're interested in more of your writing.
Oh, yeah, I have a book. I have a book that's out now. The Cruelty is the Point, which is it is about the historical roots of the Trump era and the political and ideological currents that brought us to that point. And it's funny to talk about the Trump era in past tense because I'm not sure it is.
Sure.
But yeah, it's out now. And you can read my stuff at The Atlantic. I'm a left-wing writer. So I want to give your listeners that expectation if they haven't already figured that one out. But thank you for having me on the show.
Yes, I think you're left-wing, but you're fair. And interesting, which is even more important, frankly, oftentimes. But
thank you very much, Steve.
But yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can have you on again soon. Maybe once this case comes down, we can discuss the outcome of it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stephen. Take care.
All right. And that is all we've got for you this week on the Weekly Reload podcast. Remember, members get this a day early. Please also, if you want to help the podcast grow, review it, rate it on your favorite podcasting app. That really does improve the reach of our glorious show into new ears. So that's very important, I think, for the long-term success here at the Weekly Reload podcast. And that's all I've got. So I will see you again next week. Buy a membership, subscribe to the newsletter, share this with your friends and family and everyone you know if you want to help spread word of what we're trying to accomplish here. Anyway, I will see you again next week.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend, now there's none. I made the devil run. I broke so many bones.